Welcome back to the Chapter 4 mini lecture on ethical and social responsibilities. Now, as I mentioned in all my earlier videos, this is not a replacement for you reading the chapter, and you need to make sure that you use your book in order to do well on your weekly assignments and in your research. So, let's get started by looking at some cases that were discussed in the media. Now, Bernie Madoff went to jail for 150 years for his Ponzi scheme. Jeffrey Skilling, who was at Enron, is serving a 24-year sentence, and Bernie Ebbers is serving a 25-year sentence for his corrupt practices at WorldCom. Let's look at these guys individually. Bernie Madoff was born in 1938, and he used $5,000 that he earned from being a lifeguard to fund his first investment company. He was the son of immigrants, and by most standards, he was raised in an average home. Madoff really had no interest in finance as an industry. He was educated. He transferred after 1 year at University of Alabama to go to Hofstra University. He also went to law school for a little bit at Brooklyn Law School, but didn't finish. He attracted investors to his Ponzi scheme by guaranteeing them a 10% return on their investment. Now, the interesting thing about this whole story is how he got caught back in 2008. He had informed his sons that he was planning to pay out to investors several $1,000,000, and his sons questioned where the money was coming from, and he actually admitted that he was running a Ponzi scheme. And his sons turned him in to federal authorities, and he was arrested shortly thereafter. Now, he admitted that he lost about $50 billion of his investors' money, and he pled guilty to 11 felony counts. Now, those losses have been updated, and prosecutors now say that losses totaled around $170 billion. He was found guilty and imprisoned, and he has been sentenced to 150 years. Now, Jeffrey Skilling was the former CEO of Enron Corporation. He was fined $45 million and went to jail for his unethical behavior. Now, Jeffrey Skilling was also an average type guy. He was the second of 4 children and attended Southern Methodist University in 1975. He received an MBA from Harvard in 1979. He actually started out as an energy and chemical consultant at McKinsey & Company. In 1990, Skilling went to work for Enron. He pushed an aggressive investment strategy which made Enron the largest wholesaler of gas and electricity. And while he was there, he allowed for future earnings to be reported as current earnings. And this caused the price of the stock to increase. And then in August of 2001, Skilling unexpectedly resigned and sold nearly $60 million in shares of stock. Then, in December 2001, Enron declared bankruptcy. So he's now serving a 24-year sentence in federal prison. Bernard Ebbers started out as an average guy going to school on a basketball scholarship at Mississippi College, and he managed a chain of hotels around the state. He co-founded WorldCom in 1995. Ebbers was one of 5 children born to a traveling salesman. And during the 1980s, he got involved with investment acquisition and management of telecommunication companies. And his activities resulted in his net worth being estimated at around $1.4 billion. And by outward appearances, he was a very successful person, but in 2002, an investigation uncovered that he had also been making accounting misstatements estimated at $11 billion. So he was also convicted of fraud and conspiracy. Now, Ebbers' case is known as one of the largest accounting scandals in United States history. Not only did his actions result in $180 billion in losses to investors and the bankruptcy of the company, but it also resulted in 20,000 people losing their jobs. And in all 3 of these examples, we're looking at people who put their self-interest in front of their responsibilities. And when greed becomes the primary motivator and self-interest becomes a person's sole preoccupation, unethical behavior develops. So looking back at Bernie Madoff, what exactly is a Ponzi scheme? And basically, a Ponzi scheme provides for a very good return being paid to the original investors in an investment vehicle at the expense and cost of investors that are coming on to the program today. So Madoff used money paid by the new investors in his Ponzi scheme to pay the expected returns to the older investors or the original investors. Now, the problem with this strategy is that eventually a Ponzi scheme will fail. It will fail because the expected payment to the original investors will exceed the amount of money that can be raised from the new investors. And Madoff would never be able to continue to bring on new investors at the rate required to continue to guarantee the returns. So now that we've looked at examples of corporate corruption, we can focus on defining ethics. And what are ethics? Now, the textbook tells us that ethics are standards of moral behavior, and society determines whether those behaviors are right or wrong. Now, in the course of a day, we encounter all sorts of ethical issues. If we're not encountering ethical issues, perhaps we're not paying attention to our value system. So in our society, there are basic values that most of us can agree on. Integrity, respect for human life, self-control, honesty, courage, and self-sacrifice are generally accepted as good values. Cheating, cowardice, and cruelty are generally accepted as wrong values. But how do we determine what is right and wrong in our own opinion, and upon what do we base our own judgment call? Now, on this slide, I've listed some sources of ethics. Now, obviously, part of our ethics fall back on our parents and what they taught us in terms of what is right or wrong. And just like we owe it to our children to teach them the difference between right and wrong, our parents should have accomplished that task with us. But unfortunately, children do not come with an instruction manual, and we sometimes do not teach our children everything they should know. So since we are all brought up by different parents with different backgrounds and under different circumstances, if we solely rely upon what we were taught as children to determine our ethics, it might not match with what society declares as right or wrong. And as we grow older, we learn from our relationships and our experiences about right and wrong. We develop opinions on what is right and wrong based on how we've been helped or hurt, supported, and advised. And that's why it is so important to consider the sources of all the information we receive. And this applies to media outlets as well. We should take care to receive information and then question whether or not that information lines up with our own ethical principles and expectations. Especially when we listen to the media, we are often told about a situation and then also told what to think about the situation. We might even let the media tell us whether or not it's right or wrong. Now, in considering religious beliefs, it's funny how we are brought up not to discuss religion in the workplace. And that is one area of our lives that outlines our moral and ethical values. And while a debate on the legitimacy of one religion over another might not be the type of commentary in which you want to engage in the workplace, it is important to consider that a person's religious beliefs have a huge impact on their ethics. In fact, it's a good idea to know the religious denominations of those around you, since knowing that gives you information on what their moral fabric might be. Now, sometimes it's necessary to identify values that are important to an organization or community, and it can be reduced to a code of ethics. Many companies have a code of ethics to identify those behaviors that management wants to encourage and those behaviors that management wants to discourage. And this is a little risky, though, just like relying on the legal system to set what is right and wrong. A behavior may be legal, but is it right? For example, is it legal for me to start a company that is in direct competition with the company for which I work? The answer is probably yes, it is legal. But is it right or ethical? Well, most people would say no. However, there are many companies out there that were created by employees who left employers. Now, we talked a little bit about interactions with others, and I think that's one of the easiest ways to learn how you feel about something. If you experience it yourself, then it helps you to identify behaviors as right and wrong. If you've ever had something important taken from you, you know stealing is wrong. If someone has ever told a lie about you, then you know that lying is wrong too. And if someone has deceived you, then you know that deceiving people is unethical. It is the easiest way to learn right from wrong, but it can be the most painful as well. So we should, based on the list that we're looking at here, we should get to know those around us. We should know a little bit about a person's history, their religious beliefs, how they interact with others, how they respond to a written code of ethics. And knowing all of that will give us an idea of what kind of judgment calls they might make. Now, ethical dilemmas are everywhere, like we said, and when we are confronted with trying to make a decision, many times there are several different ways to look at a problem. It is common that there might be a legally correct answer and an ethical answer, and they may not be the same. Now, let's look at a basic business opportunity. Let's say that you're the manager of the purchasing department in a manufacturing plant, and it's your responsibility to interview, qualify, and select suppliers to provide component parts to the manufacturing plant. You pick a small supplier of parts because you think that a smaller company will have lower operating costs and will be able to offer you the best price. And in your preparations for the negotiations, you've researched what the components should cost, and you have a price in mind that you're willing to pay. And when you start your negotiations, the small company is so desperate to get your business that they are willing to do and say anything. And when they gave you the price of their parts, the price fell well within the range you were willing to pay. But because you are the more dominant company and you know you can get away with it, you decide that you're going to request that the supplier come down an additional 10%, even though you know they cannot afford it. Now, the company cannot afford to lose your business, so they agree to lower their price another 10%. You didn't really have a vested interest in the 10% reduction because their original price was right on target. Now, in looking at this situation, is it legal? Why, certainly this is legal. I mean, companies negotiate prices every day, and the dominant company will always get their own way, most always get their own way. Is it balanced? Certainly not. After all, your company comes to the table with plenty of money, the budget to support their purchase, and the contract would mean everything to the small company. The smaller company came to the table hoping to make some money on the contract, keep their employees working, and with the economy being what it is, they would have to accept the contract regardless of the terms. Now, how will it make me feel about myself? Oh, I don't know. I consider myself to be a good negotiator, but I cannot allow myself to take advantage of another company just because I can. I would not feel that it's right to keep pushing for price reductions knowing that I would be eliminating almost any profit the other company would make. Now, many people do not agree with me. They think that each company should negotiate for the price they need and want, but the truth of the matter is, if the odds are stacked up against the smaller company, there is a risk that the deal will not be a fair one. Now, in the business environment, ethics start at the top. And that means that the executive team must decide on acceptable and unacceptable values and behaviors and communicate that down to the employees. And workers must feel that they are safe in discussing their concerns with their supervisors and managers if something unethical arises in their jobs. Now, in order to accomplish this, companies sometimes have an ethics code that is sanctioned by the executive team. Now, sometimes it is compliance-based, which means that unethical behavior is prevented by putting the proper controls in place at the company, or it is integrity-based, which means that it is rooted in the guiding values of the company and is perpetuated by the management. So if managers communicate the organization's vision and comply with the code of ethics, then that is a very good step in creating the right environment. And the problem is that many companies have a code of ethics and it hangs on the wall in the lobby and maybe in the conference room, and no one can even list one item that's mentioned on it. And policies and procedures are a good way of putting controls in place to help identify or prevent unethical behavior. And if these policies and procedures are written, they are an excellent tool in training employees on what is expected. Now, employees should be trained and reminded to include ethics discussions in their decisions, and if something goes wrong, people should be held accountable. Now, let me say something here. Yes, it is important to hold people accountable for unethical behavior. It is also important to remember that someone can look like they are being unethical when that was not their original intent. For example, let's say that you have a cashier that works for you. She has been with the company a while, and you trust her, but one day, she makes change to a customer and she immediately learns that she did not give back enough change. She takes the proper amount of change out of the register and puts it in her pocket to hold for the customer if the customer comes back. Of course, you as the manager see this and go crazy because it appears that the employee has just stolen money out of the register. Now, this is an example of how an employee could make a wrong decision and they did not intend to do anything unethical. To just fire a committed employee because of a bad decision creates an environment of distrust. Instead, that employee definitely needs to be retrained and reminded and perhaps warned. Now, if this happens again, then maybe more drastic measures need to be taken. But accountability doesn't mean that we fire everyone for every mistake they make. When you train employees on what should and must be done, they can be placed in positions to better protect the company. Make sure that you know the signs that might alert you to a potential concern regarding unethical behavior. Now, the book states that disgruntled employees relieve frustration by blaming, manipulating, ignoring commitments, hoarding resources, and doing the minimum. Now, while we can say that this is true, it is also something that you should be on the lookout when dealing with your coworkers and employees. People who exhibit these types of behaviors in the work environment may be more susceptible to unethical behavior than others. So it's important to know these red flags. And at the same time, it is important to remind yourself that if you are engaging in any of these activities, you might be seen as a risk to the company as well. So keep these in mind. Don't forget to read the chapter, and if you have any questions, email me.